Today, what's super about superannuation? Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to our latest post covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And today, I want to discuss the final report which has just been released by the Productivity Commission into our superannuation system. Now, this report, which is the latest in a series of releases from the Productivity Commission, really underscores the critical issues that are facing the superannuation sector in Australia. And it outlines a whole series of potential changes which potentially could benefit savers and also strangle many of the poor performers in the market. The report includes the results from 5 surveys and covered both members and funds and also looked at governance. So it's pretty comprehensive. Now, at the top level, it found that returns on average from retail funds, those are funds run by banks and other large financial institutions, were significantly below the not-for-profit, or sometimes called industry funds. So the retail return on average over a relatively long period was around 5%, whereas the not-for-profit, the industry funds, returned around 7%. But within that, some firms were performing better and others significantly worse. But if you take nothing else from this particular post, take this away. The average net return from a retail fund over the years 2005 to 2017 was 5.4%, whereas the not-for-profit sector returned 7.3%. So this shows you that a lot of the large funds, particularly those owned by the major banks and other private sector investment funds, are actually doing significantly less well than the industry funds. In fact, you would need a very good reason why not to go with the not-for-profit industry funds. And the other interesting thing about their analysis was that even if you look across the different asset classes across funds, from cash through to fixed income, listed equities, private equity, and even unlisted property, you will see that pretty much overall in every class, the not-for-profit sector performed better than the retail fund. Now, this is a rather neat chart that shows the relative distribution of funds and their performance. And they showed that around 26 funds performed above the benchmark, but 29 funds performed below the benchmark. And considerable numbers of members and assets were sitting in those low-performing funds. And it's worth also again noting that it's the retail funds predominantly who are underperforming. Now, as part of their analysis, they created a series of cameos, a way of trying to illustrate the impact of this difference in performance. So they took one example where effectively underperforming funds would be the equivalent of losing 13 years' pay. At the age of 21, with a $50,000 job, the top quartile fund would return around $1.2 million age 67, whereas the bottom quartile fund would return just $560,000, or 54% less, due to those lower returns. And they also analysed the performance of default products, which are the products that people go into if they don't make an alternative selection. And there, around 32 default products sat above the benchmark, but 17 were underperforming. And again, there's a considerable concentration in the retail sector of those underperforming funds. But they concluded that for those who are being allocated a default fund, it's a complete lottery. So again, looking at a similar Cameo, if you were in a top quartile super return, you could get $1.1 million at the age of 67 on retirement. But a bottom quartile super return was only $610,000, which is 45% less, or a loss of $502,000 over the life of the fund. Now, another factor to bear in mind is that higher fees materially erode balances into retirement. So again, looking at another Cameo, if you have a lower fee My Super fund, your return could be $833,000. But if the fees were just 0.5% higher across the life of the fund, you would lose 12% of that final value, or around $100,000, and end up with $733,000. And indeed, the impact of fees is critical because of the compounding effect year on year. So even small increases in fees have a remarkably high level of impact at the end of the saving period. And they also highlight that reported fees in Australia are higher than in many other OECD countries. And it's worth reflecting on this, that although fees have come down a little over recent years, typically you can still pay around 1.1 to 1.3% per annum on the balance of the fund. And then the question, of course, is what value do you get from those fees? And they also again show that fees are considerably higher in the retail sector relative to the not-for-profit or industry sector. And essentially what it means is that retail funds are charging a lot more, despite the fact that their performance is considerably lower. So again, there really isn't much reason to go with retail funds. You're much better to go with industry funds. And it's worth noting that more than 4 million account holders were paying above 1.5% per annum in fees, and that's over around $275 billion of assets in savings. And they make the point that high fees persist over time, year after year, eroding the value of those savings. So I think you could argue that the superannuation system has evolved into a money-making machine for the retail funds. And that is going against the interests of individual savers and their superannuation returns. And one of the other factors that's driving poor performance is also the proliferation of small funds. So typically, people will end up with multiple superannuation accounts as they move jobs. And these days, people tend to move jobs more frequently than previously. And because each of those could well end up being subscale, the fees are relatively high, the performance relatively poor. And as a result, savers end up with lower returns than they might otherwise get if everything was consolidated into a single account. And by the way, from personal experience, I can tell you that trying to consolidate individual funds into one fund is a long, complicated, and sometimes costly process. And in fact, the Productivity Commission estimated that holding multiple accounts could translate into the equivalent of losing a whole year's pay. For example, again, using that Cameo, a single super account could generate $833,000. But multiple super accounts could see that drop by 6% or $51,000 to $782,000. So you start out at the same point, but you again end up with less. Now, one of the other factors to bear in mind is that there is apparently a wide range of choice of funds. In fact, people often find it quite bewildering as to which fund they should go with. So that's why quite often they choose a default My Super fund. But often the comparisons between funds are difficult to make. And of course, past performance doesn't necessarily translate into future performance. So it is frankly another lottery. And just to add to the confusion further, People are often sold insurance policies bundled as part of a superannuation deal, never mind whether it makes sense or not. And in Cameo 5 here, they show the impact of paying an insurance premium effectively compared with not. And if you had no insurance for a relatively low-income worker, you could end up at the age of 67 with $628,000. But if you took some sort of blue-collar life insurance or some other product, and you paid a typical average insurance premium through the life of the superannuation savings, then effectively you'd end up with about 14% less in retirement due to the insurance, or that's worth about $85,000, and so your total pot would be worth about $543,000, which is a considerable difference. So if you put all those factors together, they call out what they call the character of member harm. You can end up in an underperforming MySuper product and perhaps with 45% less than you should get from your superannuation fund. You could be paying for an unsuitable life insurance policy and seeing a 14% reduction in your final value. You could be holding multiple accounts and as a result seeing 6% less value in your superannuation. And you could be a member of a high fee fund and see a 12% drop in returns. So what this means is that the chances are that many people will be getting less from their superannuation than they should. And once again, it underscores the fact that the industry is currently not operating to the maximum benefit of its members. It is actually operating to maximise profit for the retail funds and to make an investment return to the owners of the business, in the case of the for-profit businesses. So the Productivity Commission recommends a number of significant changes to the way that the superannuation system should work. The first is that there should be a mechanism whereby real choice is offered to potential members, but based on a best-in-show shortlist. What that means is that rather than just being thrown into a specific default fund or being offered a massive range without any real guidance, there is actually more information available, and that information is biased towards the better performing funds. And that means that essentially people can select and set their strategies against the choice of superannuation products that are actually there. And by the way, they also suggest that people should have the choice of a particular fund, or indeed consider a self-managed superannuation fund, particularly for larger balances, because one of the factors that they highlighted was that larger superannuation funds that are self-managed have similar or better returns compared with the industry or retail funds. That is not true, by the way, of smaller superannuation funds. Now, the report made a whole series of recommendations. I'm not going to go into them in any detail, but I'll put a link to the report below. But it does highlight a significant root and branch change to the way that superannuation works to the benefit of members. Now, one of the other issues that the productivity called out was the role of ASIC and APRA. ASIC, of course, predominantly focusing on the sales and advisory aspects of the superannuation system, and APRA, the financial structure and standards of industry participants. But the Productivity Commission underscored the fact that neither entity had really been pulling their weight. And there was a bit of bias towards the financial institutions rather than to the benefit of individual members. It's rather similar to some of the issues that we saw in the Royal Commission earlier on. The Productivity Commission refers back to the Royal Commission and said that some of the issues in terms of the role of ASIC and APRA and how they should interface with the superannuation system and the benefit of members should be part of the Royal Commission results. But one of the things they did say was that the government should make clearer the expectations that they have to both APRA and ASIC with regard to the supervision of the superannuation system, with a bias towards the benefits to individual members. And they raised the question of how precisely members' interests are going to be safeguarded and propagated. And they suggested perhaps that there needs to be an additional entity created to be able to make sure that members really get the support and the outcomes that they need. Now, I'm personally not sure whether more regulation is the right answer, but clearly what the Productivity Commission is saying is that currently members are being disadvantaged. And again, we saw that in the Royal Commission with a number of players making decisions that disadvantaged members but protected the trustees or made returns to the shareholders of those particular organisations. So there's something fundamental here about the relative priorities of members versus the corporate objectives. So bringing all this together, the recommendations from the Productivity Commission are absolutely essential to make the superannuation system work for the benefit of members. It's not doing that for many at the moment. In fact, the whole system has been rather evolved into one which supports the interests of shareholders or trustees against members. But the changes that they're talking about are substantive, and it will lead to significant restructuring across the industry. Now, the Royal Commission will have more to say on this, I think, in a month's time, and so we have to see this in the light of the upcoming Royal Commission report. But nevertheless, meantime, it's worth thinking about the superannuation arrangements that you have currently. How many different superannuation accounts do you have? What are the fees that you are paying? And are you paying for insurance that you need or don't need? Those questions are worth thinking about now. And finally, it's also worth saying that there's no certainty that the recommendations from the Productivity Commission will be taken up by government and ultimately implemented. That's because there are many stakeholders who have done extremely well out of the current superannuation system. The profitability of many players are extremely strong, and as the Royal Commission showed, many individual members have not benefited as much as they should have. So there's going to be an interesting tussle ahead between the industry overall, and particularly the retail sector, who I think have most to lose, and the interests of individual members. And it's also going to be caught up in a political stoush between Labour, who is more aligned to the industry funds through the unions that support them, relative to the retail funds, which is in the commercial sector, which is supported by the Liberal national parties. So, in a way, this whole superannuation thing ultimately becomes a political thing. And I just hope that the interests of members don't get lost in the political battles which are going to arrive ahead. And just before I go, let me remind you that next Tuesday, the 15th of January at 8 p.m. Sydney time, we're going to run our next live stream event. Feel free to join the chat on the day or send me questions beforehand. Here is a link so that you can bookmark the session. And by the way, if you like what you've seen here today, please share and like the post, add a comment or question. I read them all. And if you would like to support our efforts to provide more high-quality content, do consider supporting us via our Patreon program, here's a link, or making a contribution via PayPal. We do really appreciate the support that we've received, and it makes a huge difference in our ability to be able to cover the ground that we do and to produce the content that we produce. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.